Because I recognize that there's some folks here that were not here last week, I want to do a little bit of a reprise at least, and I've been asked to do this for the recording, which I understand is going to be available about a month after the series in the office, so that to the extent you may have any continuing interest in this, or have others who may be interested in this little series, that'll be available. To introduce myself a little bit again, this is a repeat from last week, but for those of you who are new, so my name is Dave Moore. Chris and I have been members of First Lutheran for a couple of years now, and my background is I'm an attorney, and throughout the course of my career, I've had various levels of involvement with the First Amendment and issues of involving both freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and also have had kind of an interest, for better or worse, in theology. I read a lot of theology and think about it in connection with how that fits into to my profession in particular. I represented for a number of years the school district of Janesville, and actually ran into not only issues of freedom of expression, but freedom of religion that we talk about in a little bit more in a few minutes. But I also have, in the latter stages of my career over the last 20 years, have done a lot of representation of churches involving the polity, the government of the church, and the organization of the church, and the interaction of the church with civil government. I serve as Synod attorney for the South Central Synod of Wisconsin, and have run into some of these issues in the course of that as well. So anyway, that's how I come here, and why I have an interest in it, and you can decide whether or not I know anything about what I'm talking about, and which is definitely reserve judgment. But I thought the intent of the first session was we were going to talk about the theology, about Lutheran theology regarding church and state, or Luther's theology of church and state. And that we would talk in this session about First Amendment issues. And in the next session, we would talk about kind of the current issues involving church and state. And I intentionally left that one kind of open, depending on how this went, what happened, what the discussion was, what the interest would be. So I want to get to the First Amendment, but I also want to revisit theology a little bit, because as I believe that there was some interest, Chris indicated to me that there may have been more interest in some of the slides that I had than others, and that this was one that drew some interest. This comparison, and what this comes from, just to kind of review this. This is a theologian, H. Richard Niebuhr's summary of how various denominations within the Christian church have approached Christ and culture. That is, how Christ relates to culture. And he talked about those denominations that view Christ as against culture, that separates, very conscious of separating the sacred and the secular, and so they approach that by withdrawing. And I gave the example of perhaps the Amish as one example, who withdraw from culture. there's the Christ above culture, where the church's duty is to forge a synthesis with state. That he categorizes as a Roman Catholic theology. Christ transforming culture he says, is a Reformed theology, where the goal is to try to transform culture. Reformed Protestants, I mean, this would include Presbyterians, Reformed Church of the United States, or whatever it's called, and UCC, I believe, United Church of Christ. He categorizes he refers to it as liberal religion, the Christ of culture, where culture, where the church or Christ is absorbed into the culture, and that the theory that each generation needs to take the culture with which it's faced and then see how Christ is absorbed into that. Then there's the Lutheran theology, which is different. And I want to, so Luther's idea, Luther was big on paradox when we talked about this. He thought there's this, and then there's that. And there's this, but there's that. That's a lot of his theology is like that, and I'm kind of that way myself. But Luther saw Christ and culture as being in tension, and tension is not necessarily seen as a bad thing. If we think of tension in the sense that Luther might have spoken of it, if we extended a string, perhaps a string on a violin, when it's under tension, it makes music. And when it's not under tension, it doesn't make any sound at all. So that's kind of a positive view of tension, as I think Luther understood it. So that's what we're talking about, his view of tension between Christ and culture. Now, that's Christ and culture. We're here to talk about church and state, right? Are those, but my question is how that translates, particularly in something that was not really known, or at least wasn't a thing in Luther's time, which is a democratic society in which I'm just going to ask the question of you, and please speak up, and I'm just going to remember for purposes of recording that I might repeat if you have a question or a comment, but to what extent is our government, the society we live in, a reflection of our culture? What do you think? Yeah? No? Is it? To what extent is the government we have elected a reflection of our culture?
No.
You're saying it's not? Okay.
Are we talking current or previous? Because I think that's a part of the quandary also.
All right, good question. Current or previous? Yeah. So Leslie's comment is that she sees the current government is not a reflection of the culture. Right? Is
Not
that
my culture.
right? Okay. Anyone want to take that on?
Yeah.
Go for it.
Well, I think it very much is.
Okay.
And the challenge is living in this mix.
Yeah.
Living out our views of what the gospel might be
Right.
and how that might be reflected in our faith practices.
Right.
I see Lutheran as kind of a tricky word to deal with, Dave.
Yeah.
Because there are so many streams of us.
Yeah,
About the only place up there I think Luther would be absolutely against would be the withdrawal mentality.
yeah,
Stay invested,
right,
but learn to live in the tension that comes with that, because that, as far as we know, is not going away.
right. So and I don't know whether this.
Paraphrase.
Yeah, so Roy's comment was, and I am gonna over condense, that Luther would definitely have not been in the sectarian. He would have seen, that's not very Lutheran. But the fact is I think all of you who are Lutheran know that Lutherans don't always agree, and there are various sects of Lutheranism which might disagree as to the degree, as to the question that I answered. Leslie's comment was, it's not my culture. Is it other parts of the culture that we see? Is that, or other people who don't agree with Leslie, is that reflected, does government reflect some of that? I guess the answer to that may be obvious, but so culture, culture in tension with the church. Excuse me. Well, no. Culture in tension with the church. I guess I would suggest that in one way or another, what makes the democratic system different is the extent to which government is or is not a reflection of the culture. Let me ask this in a different way. To what extent do you see reflections of our culture in our current government? What do you see reflected from our culture in the current government? I recognize that may be a dangerous question. So I'm okay with talking politics here, but because I think that this is necessarily an uncomfortable discussion that we may need to have. But any thoughts on that? Any questions or concerns about what we see reflected in government as we see it, of our culture? Go for it.
Which culture? Because
Yeah,
because it's, you know, it's kind of written in general terms, and there could be as many as 10 or 12 major cultures in our country.
right.
So which culture?
Right, so the comment is, well, there may be 10 or 12 different cultures, and can we even speak of one culture, or do we need, is it the culture of the moment, the culture that's dominating? Yeah. Other thoughts on that?
I struggle to separate government from administration.
Right, okay,
That's all.
yeah, government from administration.
Yeah, I think the living out of our culture, broadly speaking, is part of the role of government.
Right,
But government is administered.
right. So the comment is the government is administered, and of course, in our democratic society, we deal with separation of powers, which was the theory of one of the theories of the founders, that this separation would allow some leeway for how government is administered, so that one did not have too much power over the other. So I want to. So again, so Luther's concept of life in tension in general, church and state, Christ and culture, this kind of just to kind of pick up on this is a slide from last week as well, that Luther's view of God is not one of, there's the Church of Christ, then there's the government or the state, and it's not in a tier. Luther spoke of God as encompassing all, and the kingdom of God's right hand, the kingdom of Christ, and the kingdom of God's left hand is the temporal law. And I guess the point that I'm attempting to make here is the right hand and the left hand is doing isometrics, right? There is that tension. So that's kind of the theory here. Now, I also wanted to address this. I think I spoke briefly about Robert Benes, a Lutheran theologian of recent years, and he suggests, I did not talk about this last week, but there are three creative, what he refers to as Lutheran ways of dealing with the tension of Christ and culture that are particularly Lutheran, not exclusively Lutheran, but these are concepts consistent with Lutheran theology. The first is that of vocation and calling, that we are called one way or another. That we are called to, whether it be our profession, not necessarily our job, our life, but we are called to strum that string. That's what we do, and we do that. We approach that in different ways. We might even strum different strings, but that's the way we see life. We are called one way or another to decide how to deal with this. The second Lutheran way of dealing with the tension of Christ and culture is seeing the church as an instrument of persuasion. In Luther's theology, should the church be involved in persuading? Absolutely. That's Luther. So that may be being out in front on some things. And the third creative way of dealing with tension of Christ and culture is an attitude of humility and prayer. And when we talk, certainly prayer is easy enough to understand. Humility in the context of we don't provide certainty. We approach questions from the standpoint that I don't know, I'm not certain about what God wants to happen here, but I am certain that I'm called in Christ to speak as God has given me to speak. That's humility. And in general, God save us from those who are certain. Right? And that may be part of the issues here. So, I think that that it's important for us to understand this as we approach, as we're approaching government and issues of the First Amendment. I think it's also significant that we, within the ELCA, we're a democratically governed church as well. We don't have a hierarchical approach to our faith. And so what's the effect of a democratically elected or a democratically governed church on a democratically governed government, or what should it be? So I'm going to ask the question, how do you feel about the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, stating its positions on issues, and I'm going to call them social issues because it's social is the safe word, right? How do you feel about the church making statements, which it has done, and which is a big question for the ELCA right now? Should the church make statements, and I'm going to change the phrase, about public policy?
Well, as you said, it's certainly done that. I mean, there are the social statements that
Right.
have been issued from churchwide,
Right.
if you will. And I think it's part of being, as you say here, as an instrument of persuasion, being out in front.
Okay.
We're walking the walk as well as talking the talk, if you will.
Okay, so the comment is, yeah, walking the walk, talking the talk. The church has made statements called social statements. They're written, you can find them on the ELCA website, certain positions that have been taken. So, my follow-up question, are there lines that the church should not cross?
I've always trusted in the process, and maybe that's being naive, but I guess I've always thought it's come from their position has come from the bottom up, from
Okay,
and that we, as a congregation, have come to a conclusion on an issue one way or the other, and then the synod has gathered all of those opinions, and then their brain trust has come up with
okay.
a conclusion or a majority of the opinion or something. And like I said, maybe that's naive trust, I don't know.
Well, no, I don't think that is naive at all. The concept you're reflecting is that in a democratically governed church, we're a bottom-up church, right? That we see our own policies and our own understanding of our faith as not hierarchical. We aren't told what our faith is, but we live as a church, and and if I'm doing a lot of paraphrasing here, but I think what you're saying, the social statements historically have been exactly that. They have something that was not initiated from on high, but somebody said, we need to make a statement about that, we need to talk about that. I'll ask the question, I mean, thoughts, are there lines the church should not cross?
I think
Go for
so.
it. Okay.
I don't believe they should endorse political candidates.
Okay? Okay. And do you want to comment, I'm sorry, so the statement was, we should not endorse political candidates.
Right.
Do you want to say your thoughts on why that is?
Well, I think it's too divisive for,
Okay.
for the church. They unite around certain issues, and they can bring out the gospel position.
Okay.
And theology and stuff, but not the exact individual candidate.
Right, so the individual candidates, so that by doing that, by identifying a client, you're creating a division within the church itself. Is it fair?
Okay.
Yeah, good. Go ahead.
I think anything that does not have a derivative from the base of religion should be out of bounds.
Okay,
Because the basis of the ELCA's decision-making is based in faith.
okay,
So anything that's out of bounds of that, how can that be relative in their decision-making?
okay. So it needs to be, whatever it is, it needs to be a faith-based initiative. Okay? All right?
Then there's always the scriptural reference to put not your trust in any princes of the earth.
Yeah. So, put not your trust in any princes
Or
of the earth.
princesses.
Yes.
Of the earth.
Yeah. So, let me just point out, I guess, as if, before moving on, that if there, have you ever felt that the church has gone too far in making a statement? That doesn't, you don't even necessarily need to be talking about the ELCA. Have you seen instances where churches have, you think, have gone too far in making statements?
I think that's a two-sided coin.
Okay,
In that, have they gone too far or have they not gone far enough in addressing an issue?
okay,
So
yes, okay.
it's a two-sided.
Right, and that's the broader question, if they're not gone far enough. I think that the instance, here, the endorsement of political candidate, that is a suggestion, that if a church has done that, and I don't know if you're aware of a church that has, they've gone too far, is the point that's being made there. I think that we need to recognize that we've talked about these kind of concerns, that I think number one, okay, the concerns, and I'm gonna look at this maybe from the pastor's point of view, and I've had a discussion with the pastor about this, the role, that tightrope that pastors walk in how they approach deciding what to say and how to say it. There's the concern about alienating members, which we know what the effects of that is. But we also, underneath that, which is really something that is less, not so much a First Amendment concept or a theology concept, in our society it's become a tax exemptions question, right? To what extent does the way our government works have direct financial effects as a result of taxes? So anyway, I wanted to raise all these questions. And before I move on to the First Amendment, I couldn't resist this. I had to ask, what would Luther think? That's my question. What would Luther think of the instead of, I won't say of the new pope, but of the papacy as it exists today? And some of the things we've heard, and a lot of speculation over the last few days, right? You think what Luther would like this guy?
I hope so.
Yeah, you say, I hope so. And why?
Because he seems to have the people in mind.
Yeah,
He seems down to earth and
yeah. Okay, any other thoughts on the new pope? Come on, I know you've been talking about this, right?
I wonder if Luther would say, could we talk?
Yeah.
let's say what?
Could we talk? Would Luther say, could we talk? As you know, I mean, Luther was not, he would say, I didn't separate myself from the papacy has separated itself from me, or I did not separate myself from the Roman Catholic Church. I think that, to me, one of the interesting things about, as you hear all the news commentary and frankly the political implications of this is, the ELCA, great, we've got 8 million members. Roman Catholic Church, 1.2 billion members. And when we talk, the discussion that has occurred about, as an American Pope, intention with whether this Pope will be in tension with current government is going to go right back where I started. I think Luther would have liked the tension. That's what the church is supposed to be doing. So anyway, you kind of got to wonder. So I'm gonna move on to and now talk about the First Amendment. So I'm out of theological realm now. I'm purely in the realm of law. And you recall when I talked about this last week, we got to think about which hat we're wearing as we approach questions of church and state from our church, we're in our church hat, and then how we approach it as American citizens. How do we see the interaction, recognizing that that the faith with which our government interacts is not necessarily the same faith as ours. And so we're now putting on that, we're going to put on that hat as an American. It doesn't have to be a MAGA hat. No, it's just a hat, okay? So this is the First Amendment, and I don't know how often we talk about it as a concept, but how often do we read it? One of the remarkable things about it is how much is packed into that. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. I'm going to put that up in a different form. A lot in there. Anybody have any thoughts as to why that's all packed in there? Or why would they do that? Couldn't they have listed 6 amendments? And any thoughts as to why that is?
How's my understanding of the language here?
Yeah. It's politicians' language. But
Yeah, that, clearly it's come from a lot of folks got an agenda
Yep.
here.
Yeah.
I thought there was something about an article of the amendment. How does that break out? As a lawyer, do you know how that works? What's an article
Yeah,
within the amendment?
well, the First Amendment just has, this is the First Amendment.
it?
But
Okay.
if we're talking about different amendments, like the 14th Amendment, which does need to enter into discussion, but we'll get back to that. There's a Section 1 and a Section 2, or an Article 1 and an Article 2. This one that's it. But it's a lot in very few words. I asked this question, so when I was representing the school district, and this some years back, I'm going to say, boy, it could be 20 years back, there was an issue of a student at Parker High School who had, in the course of giving a speech presentation, and the students were said they could talk about whatever they wanted, he proceeded in his speech to announce that he was an atheist, and he proceeded to do 2 things. One was he tore up a Bible, and the second thing he did was to basically speak in derogatory terms about the Christian faith. You think we had a First Amendment issue? We did. But what was, and there are lots of things, and this, we don't have enough time to talk about what the issues were involved there. But the reason I wanted to refer to that is as part of how that was handled, one of the things that I had the opportunity to do was to go to a class at Parker High School. It was by invitation. It wasn't by invitation. It was how they decided. I think it was the juniors. Brought them into a classroom, and we talked about about the First Amendment, and how that applied to the situation, and why this was a concern from the school's point of view. And I asked the question. I asked him, why do you think all of that stuff is in there? And one student raised her hand, and she said, this is profound for me. Those are all the things that make me who I am. Wow. And yeah, that's that's, I think, touches the bases nicely. These are all certainly central concepts to how we think of our society. And I'm gonna, if you want to take this apart into pieces and analyze all of these concepts, there is online, it's part of Congress.gov, it's actually administered by the Library of Congress. And there's the first one is, that's the link. If you want me to send you that link, that's my email on the bottom, if you want, because I recognize that's long. But it is really a fantastic source of little short essays. I mean, there's dozens on the First Amendment alone, but also on each of the other amendments. It's in easy words. It explains the history. It explains where this came from, how this came together, and it's really a great source. And I'm not, way more than we could talk about here today. But what I want to, excuse me, what I want to do is give you just a little bit of a taste of how we got to that, the First Amendment. So now I'm going to bring up Luther very briefly again. Luther is nailing his 95 theses on the church door in Wittenberg, I believe 1517, right? 500 years ago. We just celebrated that a few years ago. At the same time, in England, some different things are going on. Henry VIII is in power, and Henry VIII is having his issues. Chris and I have been watching the series Wolf Hall on public TV, and that's the story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. And Henry wants a divorce, and the church doesn't. The Pope is not approving of this, and the political machinations are great. But out of all of this, what happens is the Church of England is created, and the Church of England, created by act of Parliament with the heavy hand of Henry VIII, and the hands of kings were much heavier in those days. 1534 creates the Church of England, further developed by Queen Elizabeth, his daughter, who he never thought would be the one succeeding him, was further developed, the concept of the Church of England. And the Church of England, by taking over its role, I mean, it's essentially, the Church of England is saying, we're going to have a state church. And that means that the courts that were ecclesiastical courts are also going to come under the jurisdiction of the state. Now, the ecclesiastical courts, we thought, okay, that had to do with issues of spiritual conformity, right? Whether you're preaching right, and there's a system in the church, there still is, to decide whether this is a correct or what the correct issue of spiritual teaching in conformity with the church is. But in those days, marriages were also governed by the ecclesiastical courts, tithing, wills, and estates, and issues of defamation. There was a lot, and this all got pulled into the civil courts in England. Church of England dictated the form of worship. If you were going to hold office, if you were going to be a member of Parliament, you had to be a member of the Church of England. Education was controlled by the churches. Now, the Church of England would have said, okay, if you're going to do a worship service, you're going to do it our way. But in theory, they would have said, but we have freedom of conscience. You can believe whatever you want. You just can't hold a worship service or hold office or any of those good things. So, we tend to think of how that translated into the colonies. Hey, we're all about freedom of religion, right? Not so much. Depending on where you were in the colonies. So, Virginia, oldest colony, adopted the Church of England. No problem. The colonies are existing. Our church, our state church, our colony church is the Church of England. Done deal. Other states handled it differently. Massachusetts and Connecticut, you got the Puritans. Now, the Puritans left England because they were persecuted, right? So they went to New England so they could worship in freedom. But that meant they could worship in freedom, not where anybody else. The Puritans had no tolerance for other faiths. Other colonies handled a little bit differently, and I put up here, and I don't know if you remember this from American history, but Roger Williams was a Puritan who had the audacity to be at odds with the Puritans, and so he went to Rhode Island, and his idea was, now we're not going to do this church-state thing. You can worship, you can do whatever you want in this state. We're just going to do this differently. Pennsylvania was also a very tolerant state. William Penn was a Quaker, had been the victim. I mean, Quakers were persecuted in Massachusetts and Connecticut. It wasn't a perfect tolerance. I mean, in Pennsylvania, there was a little bit ambivalent about it. You still, office holding was dependent on what church you were a member of. The Sabbath was strictly enforced. No working on the Sabbath. Swearing, drunkenness, and fornication. It was a kind of a Puritan lifestyle, but with a little more freedom of speech. So, this is Roger Williams. This is a quote. A wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. When we talk, the phrase, one of the things you noticed in the First Amendment, separation of church and state, it ain't there. It doesn't say that. But the concept comes from Roger Williams. It's one of the places it comes from, where he talked about the question of separation, and where he was coming from is, no, we gotta, church, stay away from the state, state, keep away from the church. That was kind of his thing. The concept is that civil states should not be the judges of spiritual matters. That's Roger Williams. So, from there, time marches on from the 1600s to the 1700s, the late 1700s. The colonies are deciding, okay, we're going to do a new thing. And beginning in Virginia, right? Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, all these, Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is my first cousin 11 times removed. I learned this just a couple of years ago. But all these people are coming out of Virginia, and they are beginning to talk about this before the Revolution. The same year the Declaration of Independence is signed, in 1776, the Virginian Parliament is trying to decide. They can see what's going to happen. So what are we going to do? We've been operating under the Church of England, right? What do we do? And there's just, some people are saying, well, we still got to have it. We got to have a state church. It can't be the Church of England, right? What do we got to have a church? And others are, but there's issues of freedom. We got Baptists here. How do we treat them? It's one thing to tolerate them. It's another to allow them to be in the legislature. How's that going to work? They adopted a constitution in the state of Virginia, and it said all men are equally entitled to the free exercise of religion. Back up. I don't know if I mentioned this. The free exercise. There are 2 clauses regarding religion in the First Amendment. One is known as the Establishment Clause, and the other is the Free Exercise Clause. And there are whole bodies of law. And if you go into if you want to read more about this, in the website, I refer to it, it explains, okay, these are free exercise issues. These are establishment issues. So, they adopt a state constitution. Now, you may know, the Declaration of Independence, it's easy to declare our independence relatively, no, it wasn't easy, but the colonies declare their independence, but then they operate under the Articles of Confederation for 10 years. There's no constitution as we know it. And so the states are kind of taking the lead. Virginia, 10 years later, just about the time that the Constitution is being adopted, creates a statute for religious freedom. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, was way more proud of what he did in Virginia than he was of writing the Declaration of Independence. The statute for religious freedom, the disestablishment of religion, that they adopted a law that essentially said the state can't recognize an establishment of religion. And so Virginia decided, we're not going to have a Church of England, we're not going to have a Church of Virginia. We're not going to do that anymore. So, now you might have noticed the first line. These are all concepts, but that first line, Congress shall make no law. Well, that doesn't say anything about states. It just says Congress. So how does that come into play? Doesn't that mean, can't a state create an official religion? So how does that work? And what if a state says, you know what, we're not going to allow Baptists in our state? The First Amendment doesn't seem to address that. Well, what happened is 1866. What had just happened before 1866? Civil War. The slaves have been freed. And a constitutional amendment is adopted, the 14th Amendment, and this is Article 1 of, not the whole 14th Amendment. This is, and boy, there's a lot packed in there as well. It has as much or greater effect on our system of government as anything. All persons born or naturalized in the United States, including slaves, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That's where equal protection, that's there. A lot of stuff packed in there. Now, that doesn't say anything about religion either, does it? What's happening during this time and after 1866 is the states themselves are adopting their own constitutions. States are being created. Wisconsin's being created in 1848. And they're incorporating freedom of religion, the same concepts as Virginia, into their own state constitutions. It's not in the federal constitution, but then this gets plugged in. Years pass, and we get to actually after the Second World War, and the United States Supreme Court says, you know what, what does this mean when the state shall not make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of the citizens of the United States? Well, what does that mean? Supreme Court created what's still called the doctrine of incorporation. Now I get to talk about a civil doctrine, not a theological doctrine. Doctrine of incorporation. And what that means is we're going to say that the intent of that is generally to plug in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, or most of them anyway. This kind of developed over a matter of years. But the First Amendment certainly is incorporated into the Constitution, and that means not only can the federal government not do this, state government can't violate the First Amendment either. That's the doctrine of incorporation, and that's how we got to where we are now. So that's why we have these two concepts in the United States of freedom of expression, not only freedom of, let me go back. I always have a mental block. The Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause. Those are incumbent upon states itself. Now, if you look at the Wisconsin Constitution, you'll see a different phraseology, but essentially the same concepts, and arguably even more restrictive than the federal Constitution. But these are built in. Now, as we talk about freedom of religion, we have this concept and we have this concept. But if you look at what's happening now, and one of the arguments that's being made by some Christian bodies is to concentrate on freedom of speech as central to freedom of religion. Why is that? comes about in the context of when federal money is being distributed, and it is being distributed to secular organizations, like private schools or whatever it might be. But churches aren't allowed to have any of that money. You are violating those churches' freedom of speech. The fact that they speak in a religious, from a religious perspective, is no less a freedom of expression than for anybody else. That's the concept. So actually, all three of these things are coming into play as we talk about church and state today. Now, again, and I guess I'm going to ask if you want to, if you have any suggestions for the issues of church and state that you'd like to talk about next week, please let me know. Either my email was on there, or if you want to suggest something now or after class, please do so. We can talk about more about that. And one of the things that I think I do want to talk about is the concept of Christian nationalism, which we touched on briefly in the first class, and how understanding that and what and where that comes from, and how and what we may or may not think about that. And so we could probably talk about that for a whole class, but there are other issues we could talk about in terms of, and the thought is current issues of church and state. But I want to ask here today, in the couple minutes we have remaining, in light of what the First Amendment and its history, and in light of what you think from any other source, is the United States of America a Christian nation? You can go anywhere you want with that. Thoughts? If you're asked the question, somebody from outer space, is the United States of America a Christian nation?
I would say no,
Okay, no.
because we're not all Christians.
Because we're not all Christians, okay?
I would say yes, because we think we are all Christians.
A lot of us do.
We don't
anyway.
accept
Yeah.
that there are non-Christians.
So because of the label of Christianity, most of us call ourselves Christians, but we may mean different things by that. I'm sorry, I'm paraphrasing too much, please. But the answer was yes, because we think we are Christians. Any other thoughts on the concept of the United States as a Christian nation?
I guess when I say we're not, because there are so many different people from different cultures here, and there are many different religions.
Right.
And so the United States is more than just Christian. You
Sure.
don't have one single, I mean, like, we've been to Argentina many times, and down
Mhm.
there, Catholicism is the name,
Right.
you know.
Right.
And so to me, it's really not a Christian nation because of the people that live here.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm not thinking in the way you are.
Well, I agree with you
Yeah.
that we're not a Christian nation, but I think we are.
Right.
We
And
consider
I'm gonna
it.
say that Leslie's saying, no, we're not, because of the number of faiths
Right.
that we have here. And I think but we have this, what views itself as a large majority who would identify as Christians, and therefore we view ourselves as being at least principally a Christian nation. even though there's a wide variety as to what that means. Now I'm trying to synthesize and paraphrase both of them, but I'm sorry, I shouldn't do that. So, any other thoughts on United States as a Christian nation, what that means? Go ahead.
Question, is there a standard definition of what a religion is?
Yeah, well, I think that's a good question. The question was, is there a standard definition of what a religion is? And I think that that's one of the questions that we are facing today. The founders certainly thought of religion as universal, right, or virtually universal. And now, and this isn't intended to be pejorative, but now we view religion as an option among many, right? And so we think of that term in a different way, and that makes it difficult for us to talk about religion, because we may be talking about different things. I would say, and theologians have written about this, that everybody has a religion, and it's the thing that is of ultimate importance to them. We just don't necessarily identify that as a religion. That's the way Dietrich Bonhoeffer and all the great theologians thought of it. You call it, everybody believes in something, and so. But the words are important in the way we use that term, religion. I'm going to leave you with just one thought on that question in terms of how the founders thought about this. We're going to go back just for a second to 1786 and a few years thereafter. And in the United States is for the first time experiencing, not for the first time, they are dealing with the issue of foreign relations. How do we present ourselves to the world? And the United States needs to enter into a treaty with Tripoli. Tripoli, that's in the Marine humor. Tripoli. Tripoli is a Muslim nation in 1790s, not one of others. And so the United States has to enter into a treaty as religion, as people of faith, of one form or another. This is what the Treaty of Tripoli says in 1797. The United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. No pretext arising from religious opinion shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. 1797. So the point that they certainly a different understanding of religion at that time, but this was what was put into the treaty, and this has led to, I think this is part of when we talk about the issue of Christian nation, and when we get to Christian nationalism next week, that we may talk about some more. So, any other? I'm sorry, I'm over time. Any other questions you want to raise or comments you want to make? If not, we'll close with prayer. Lord, we thank you for our history, for our heritage, for the life you've given us. Help us to live in the tension of our lives and view that tension as a gift, as a way in which we live the life you have given us. Give us courage, give us understanding, give us wisdom, give us grace, give us the things that we need to live as people of faith and as citizens of our country. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.